Hi everyone, welcome to Introduction to Landmark Designation webinar. My name is Kara Hahn and I'm a Principal Planner with Landmark Preservation for the City and County of Denver. We're going to go over the background to landmark designation, the requirements for a property to be designated, the process of designation, and then what it means to be designated. But first we wanted to go over a little bit about participating in the webinar. If anyone has any questions, we will have time at the end to answer any questions. You can type your Q&A, your questions into the Q&A, or if you're on the phone, you can press 6 to unmute. So first, let's start with an overview of historic designation. Landmark designation was established in 1867 by an ordinance with Denver City Council. They said that the reason for designation was the reason for landmark preservation was to designate, preserve, and protect, to foster civic pride, to stabilize and improve the aesthetic and economic vitality of the city, and to promote good urban design. In the approximately 55 years that Landmark has been established in the City and County of Denver, we have 352 individual landmarks, 56 historic districts, which you can see on the map here to the left. The small red dots are the individual landmarks, and the colored boxes are historic districts. The number of properties that are designated total about 6,800 primary buildings out of the approximately 160,000 buildings in the City and County of Denver. For some information about the composition of the districts, they are primarily residential in nature, but there are 5 commercial or downtown districts and 1 historic cultural district, which is the 5 Points district. 56 historic districts sounds like a lot of properties, but it's really only about 4% of the city, or about 1 in 25 structures that are designated, which is about on par with cities our size. And here's some examples of properties that have been designated in Denver. And here in the center, we see 4 Mile Park, which is what we believe is the oldest property that is designated in Denver. It is located near the Target in Glendale, and it was a stage stop. And so it shows how we have seen a change in space and geography in Denver. That's something now that is really embedded into the city. At one point was so far outside the city that it required a change of horses or a rest for the horses before you could move forward into the rest of the city. And then you see some other buildings that are really related to transportation in Denver, and you can see how our properties tell the stories of Denver. And then on the 2 properties on the bottom right and the bottom left, the bottom right is the First Unitarian Society, and it is the first property that was designated for the LGBTQ history, not only in Denver, but in the state of Colorado. And then on the left, you see a property that is associated with Dr. Justina Ford. She was the first African-American woman doctor in the City and County of Denver, and was really integral to the history of Denver, particularly in the 5 Points community. And so the properties that are designated in Denver, they can be really modern, as you're seeing at the top of the screen, or much older buildings on the bottom of the screen. They can be smaller houses, or they can really be larger architect design buildings. So designations within Denver can vary in size, type, and what they're important for. A little bit about the process for designation. So in Denver, who can apply for designation? Well, in Denver, it's really a community-driven process. Typically, designations come forward from owners of properties or for 3 residents of Denver. It can also be put forward by members of City Council, and very, very rarely, the manager of community planning and development can also submit designation applications. But in Denver, designation is really a grassroots process. It comes from members of the community who look around and see buildings that are important to the history of Denver and decide that these need to be preserved. The process of designation is outlined in the Landmark Ordinance, or Chapter 30 of the Denver Revised Municipal Code. And the requirements are that the structure maintains integrity, that it is 30 years of age or older, or is of exceptional importance if it's less than 30 years of age, and that the structure meets at least 3 out of 10 criteria. And we'll go over the criteria here. So we recently, over the last several years, looked at the properties that have been designated in Denver. And through an update to our ordinance, found that we wanted to change the criteria. Only 2 to 3% of all of Denver's designated properties represent the diversity of Denver. And so we looked at landmark staff as well as a community task force, looked at ways to diversify landmark designation. And so we added the 3 criteria at the bottom, which are the cultural criteria that I'll go over in a minute. So each of the criteria are associated with areas of significance. The first 2 are associated with the significance of the history of Denver. And so the first one, if there's an important event that occurred or through the historical development of the city. Criterion B is associated with a recognized person or groups of persons who are important to Denver's history. The next 3 criteria are associated with architecture. It could be significant for an architectural style or type of building. A property could be significant if it's associated with a recognized architect or a master builder. So that can include craftsmen, stonemasons, things of that type. And then under criterion E, a property can be significant if it's associated with an innovation or technical achievement. This one isn't used very often, but occasionally a property, a structure has been designed in such a way that it would be a technical achievement to have designed it. And so that is used occasionally. The next group or areas of significance are properties that are geographically important to the city and county of Denver. So the first one is if it's an established and familiar feature of your neighborhood, if it's an important part of your community, if it has a prominent, often a prominent location or is really has strong physical characteristics. The second geographic criteria is associated oftentimes with a really rare resource. Earlier on, you saw some pictures of 2 frame buildings. It's currently where Cuba Cuba is located. And we don't really have a lot of frame buildings left in the city and county of Denver that are historic. And so those are significant for their rarity because it's something that we don't really see. Early in Denver's history, we had several fires that burned down most of or large portions of the city. So the city required that everything was built in brick. So anything of these frame structures that have remained are really rare. And so it was significant for its rarity. And then finally, the last 3 criteria are associated with the cultural criteria. And so these are to help understand the culture and heritage of Denver. And these can be things that are, as we talk about, a source of pride or that are important to a community. For example, if someone wanted to designate Cheeseman Park for its association with the LGBT community, this was where pride parades, which were initially pride protests, were started and held. The community would meet in Cheeseman Park, would march down to Civic Center, and then would come back for a picnic at Cheeseman Park. Currently, it's where Pride is started. It's where the Pride Parade starts before it the parade moves down to Civic Center. So this would be a really important way to celebrate the LGBTQ+ community. Finally, the last criteria could be associated with social movements, institutions, or patterns of growth or change that contributed to the culture of a community, neighborhood, city, state, or nation. So this is really intended for things like civil rights movements, for the Chicano movement, for the gay rights movement. And so we wanted with these cultural criteria to span the spectrum of things that are important to a culture or in a community that they want to celebrate, as well as things that may be a little more difficult to talk about, but are really important to be recognized. And so for a property to be designated, it needs to meet 3 out of 10 of these criteria. And if a property does that, then it also needs to retain integrity, which is really just the preservation way of saying, would prior residents of the city recognize these properties? And as you can see from the color images of both of these buildings and then the black and white images, that the buildings look pretty much like they used to look like. And so integrity is just the preservation way of saying, does this look like what it used to look like? And so if a property meets the 3 out of the 10 criteria and retains integrity, it has the opportunity to come forward and be designated. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the process of designation. What does that look like? So it starts first with a pre-application meeting with landmark staff. There's a really simple 1-page form that someone can fill out. It's on our website. They can email it in to landmark staff. And then we set up a meeting with the applicant. And the intent of that is to go over the process, the overview, to provide a preliminary recommendation for landmark staff as to whether or not if we think the property would meet the criteria and retain integrity. It's a lot of work to write a designation application, so we want to make sure that before anyone goes to the work of that they've talked with landmark staff and understand what the process looks like and if the property has the potential to be a Denver landmark. At that point, the applicant would prepare the application and do the research. This tends to be the longest part of the designation process. It can be done by the property owner or the homeowner, or it can be you can hire a consultant to help you with the application. We as landmark staff are always a resource to help with the preparation of a designation application. And we are currently writing a guide to help with a criteria guide and process guide that will help members of the community write a designation application. We as staff also recommend that the applicants reach out to city council members and the neighborhood organizations around them to let them know that a designation application is coming. Once an application is submitted, we as landmark staff will send emails out to the registered neighborhood organizations, which are just the community groups, and the city council members. And it's always helpful that people aren't hearing it first from a city staff member, but really that it comes from whoever's preparing the application. During the process of writing the application, you can submit drafts to Landmark, and we are happy to provide some input, let you know what parts look really good and what parts maybe need a little bit more work. So we're happy to help with that process through a sort of an iterative process of submitting draft applications to us. Once a final formal designation application has been submitted, Landmark staff will review it and provide a recommendation as to whether or not we think the property meets the designation criteria. And if we do, the property is then sent to the Landmark Preservation Commission for their review. Both Landmark staff and the Preservation Commission narrowly look at the application. Does it meet the criteria? We have a really narrow view of does it meet the criteria as established in the Landmark Ordinance. Before the Landmark Preservation Commission meeting, there's going to be some public notification. We're going to put signs up on the property. It will invite people to come forward, and the Landmark Preservation Commission will review the application. They'll hear from the public as to whether or not they think it meets the criteria. And then the Landmark Preservation Commission, upon deliberation, can make a couple of determinations. They can find that the application does not meet the process, does not meet the criteria. They can terminate it there. They can ask for additional information and continue the item. Or if they believe that it meets the criteria, they can recommend approval and they would forward it to Denver City Council. Denver City Council is the final authority on whether something is going to be designated or not. And there are a series of meetings before Denver City Council for them to hear whether or not they find it meets the criteria. But at the public hearing, which is the final meeting before Denver City Council, they have the authority to look beyond the criteria, but to take into the account of the property owner's wishes and other items that may be appropriate, that they feel is appropriate to make a determination. So while Landmark staff and the commission looks really narrowly at the criteria, the threshold and the authority of Denver City Council is more broad. And if they determine that the property meets the criteria for designation, through their vote, the property would become designated effective upon the mayor's signature. And so that's the general process of designation. And so from the time a landmark application is submitted through going through Denver City Council is typically a 2 to 4 month process, just depending on when we can get on agendas for the Landmark Preservation Commission and on Denver City Council agendas. The longest part of the process typically is preparing the application by the applicant. And once a property is designated, one of the questions that we get the most is, what does that mean? What's the result of being designated? So we wanted to go a little bit into this process. There are going to be some other webinars that go into more detail on both the design and demolition review, but I wanted to give just a really brief overview of what does it mean to be designated. So any property that there are any proposed changes to the exterior of the building would go through design review. However, properties are designated as is. There's no requirement to approve a property or to restore it to a particular time period. So these are only if the property owner wishes to make changes to the exterior of the building. And they would follow a set of design guidelines with the intent of preserving the historic character of the property. The design guidelines provide clear and predictable regulations for both the owners, the applicants, as well as landmark staff and the commission members. If someone is proposing to demolish a building, that is highly discouraged and would require commission review once a property has been designated. We wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of what are the properties or what are the things that we review and what are the things that Landmark does not review. So as I stated earlier, a property, we review any work on the exterior of the building that requires a building or zoning permit. And so these are things such as new construction, additions to a building. If someone wants to build a new garage or an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, windows. So if someone wants to put in egress windows, window or door replacement is something that we would review, as well as re-roofing, and then a series of exterior alterations such as electrical and mechanical changes, fences and retaining walls, curb cut signage, and solar. Sustainability is something that's really important, and so solar panels are something that are encouraged, but there is a review process for those. And then here are some of the things that Landmark doesn't review. So we don't review any interior alterations. Anything that's going on in the interior of the house is not something that Landmark reviews. We don't review paint colors. We don't review any repair and maintenance. We don't review storm windows. We have no purview over vegetation, so we don't review any plants, trees, gardens. That's not something that we review. We don't review anything that's below grade work. In terms of the process of design review, so about 80% of all of the Landmark projects that we get in are administratively approved by staff. We get approximately 1,600 applications or more annually. And so the reviews that are done by staff are divided into two buckets. There's a quick review, which is something that we typically review in about 24 to 48 hours, so about one business day. And those are things like re-roofing, replacing existing fences or rear decks, existing AC units, things that are already there that can be just need to be updated. Those are things that we review fairly quickly. Then we have smaller projects that are typically reviewed in about 10 to 15 business days. And those are things like fences, new garages, solar panels. If someone's adding a small rear addition or alterations at the rear or side of the building, those are things that can be administratively approved by Landmark staff. The Landmark Commission reviews larger projects that don't clearly meet the design guidelines, that are like new infill construction of a brand new primary building, really large rear additions, accessory dwelling units, or the replacement of historic windows. Anything that goes to the commission, there's a 4-week filing deadline. And during those 4 weeks, we work with the applicant to make sure that the project is ready to go before the commission. And these are put before the commission in the order in which they were received, first come, first serve. A lot of people are a little bit afraid of approaching the commission, but approximately 90 to 95% of everything that is reviewed by the commission is approved. It's just that they're larger in scale and are things that the staff cannot administratively review. And so that's a really brief overview of the intro into design review. But next month, you'll get the webinar focuses on design review. It'll go more into detail of what that process is. And so finally, we wanted to talk about the benefits of landmark designation. So one of the primary benefits is if a property is designated, they can take advantage of state historic preservation tax credits. These are tax credits, they're not deductions on your state taxes. This is a program that is run by the state of Colorado at History Colorado, but within the city and county of Denver for residential properties, they're administered by Landmark Preservation. And this is for the rehabilitation of historic materials or in things that keep the building in going. So this can be interior or exterior. It's the only time we would ever look at anything on the interior of a property. And so it can include things like re-roofing, repointing, woodwork, a lot of that maintenance stuff that we may not typically review for design review, but are things that you could get tax credits for. It also includes window rehab, and then systems that keep the building going, HVAC, electrical, and plumbing. And so it's a 25% credit currently. It's typically 20%, but because there was a state of emergency that had been declared for the next 5 years, the tax credit goes up to 25%. So for a residential property, it does cap out at $50,000, but it's 25% of what is used to rehab the property. So if your project costs $100,000, $25,000 of that could be taken as a state tax credit. If you don't owe that much in 1 year, it can be taken out over the course of 10 years. So this can be a really good way to help maintain your building and help get a little bit of funding for that. If a property is also listed on the National Register, they can get federal tax credits. This, however, is only for income producing or basically commercial buildings. It is run by History Colorado and the National Park Service, but these two, the state tax credits and the federal tax credits, can be leveraged together. And there will be an upcoming webinar talking a little bit more in detail about tax credits, but it is something that is a benefit to being historically designated. And then finally, one of the other benefits of designation is flexibility with the building and zoning code. So on occasion, when doing work on the property and conforming to requirements from the building or zoning code would have an adverse impact upon the historic character of a structure or a historic district, there can be some flexibility allowed in changes. This has to go before the Landmark Preservation Commission, and they would make a motion, they would make a recommendation, and those can be either administrative adjustments or can go to the Board of Adjustment for variances. But it's often for things like exceptions to height and bulk plane. A Board of Adjustments is typically more typically used for setbacks, but there are some provides some flexibility in the building and zoning code for certain cases. And then finally, there's economic and public recognition that comes from being designated. It has been found, there have been a series of studies looking at the economics of historic preservation, particularly in the state of Colorado. And so they've been looking at historic districts throughout the state and three particular ones here in Denver: the Wyman District, the Whittier-Coalfield District, and then the Quality Hill Historic District. And they've studied the property values of those historic districts, as well as properties just outside the district that are comparable. And they found that on average, historic properties are stable. They're slightly higher than the properties surrounding, but overall, historic designation is a stabilizing force on the economic value of your property. In addition to the stabilizing effect, properties that are also designated are eligible to apply for the Colorado Historical Fund. It's the Colorado State Historical Fund is a granting agency run by History Colorado. It is a competitive grant process, but being designated does provide you the opportunity to apply for those grants. And then there's just the public recognition, the acknowledgement of the importance of a property, of preserving a property that reflects all of Denver's history, that is important to the community. And if it's an individual structure that is designated, there's a plaque that comes along with it that recognizes that this property has been designated for the city and county of Denver and that it's an important property within our history. And so if there are any questions, I would be happy to take any. But I also wanted to let people know about the upcoming webinars. There is the introduction to Landmark Design Review. And then we're going to go into a little more detail and specifics about design review, talking about signage, window replacements, infill and new construction in historic districts. Then later in the summer, we'll talk about preservation tax credits, one of the programs that we have, which is the Discover Denver Survey Program. And then we'll also talk a little bit about our demolition review policies. And so if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those. And if not, thank you very much. We appreciate you attending the webinar. So if you do have any questions, please click the Q&A and you can put those in there. Or if you happen to be joining on the phone, I believe you hit #6 to unmute yourself. like there are a couple of questions coming in. Looks like the first question is from, sorry, I apologize. I had a timer to make sure that I was on time. Just went off, I apologize. The first question is from Elizabeth. We're going to promote you to panelist, and then you can turn on your video if you want and your microphone so you can ask the question. And so Elizabeth, you can unmute yourself and
Oh, hi. I don't really need to be unmuted. I'm multitasking. I just was, these slides are very dense and you were very timely, and therefore, will we be able to get these slides so that we can dig into this information?
Yeah, sure. So if you want to, you can email us at landmark@denvergov.org. And that you can email us and we'll email them back to you. This webinar will also be posted on our website, so you can go and listen to it again if you want, but they'll be put up there, and so if you just want to email us, we'll send you a copy of those.
Okay,
we're
great.
happy to do that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then it looks like we have another question from, just says GB, we'll be promoting you. Hi, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Georgia, and I'm wondering, I live in a historic building in the Pennsylvania Historic District,
Mm-hmm.
and I own a condo in this building. There are 3 buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Are tax credits available for work that's done that, obviously we pay for through assessments? Are tax credits available to individual condo owners?
That's a good question, but it's a little bit of a complicated question. It depends on how your HOA is set up. We've had ones where the HOA itself can take the tax credits depending on where the work occurred, and we've also had options where property owners could take the tax credits themselves. So it's a little bit complicated and a little bit depending on how your governing documents are set up and just some of the precise language of that. But if you have specific questions, feel free and email us at the landmark@denvergov.org, and we can talk with you a little bit, set up a time to talk with you specifically, because it's a little bit complicated, but it is something that is available to condo units and condo HOAs.
All right, thank you.
Sure, no problem. And it looks like the next question is for Joanne, if she'll be promoted, and you feel free and ask your question.
Oh, yes, hello. I was just curious about the application fees, if that's something you could touch on, or just let me know which of the sessions coming up, which of the webinars might address that.
Oh, yeah, so the only application fee is to be designated. There are no fees associated with design review. There is a fee associated with the certificate of demolition eligibility, which is the demo review process. So if you're planning on demolishing a building outside a historic district, we do review those. And so that is a $250 fee. But aside from that, the only other time there's a fee is for designation, and that helps pay for staff time, because it's a pretty labor intensive process, and helps pay for, it's an individual landmark, pay for the bronze plaque that we would work with you to get made, and you can come and pick it up at our office. So it's a $250 fee if it's an individual. And then if it's a historic district, it's a sliding scale depending on the size of the district. Somewhere it's typically about $500 to $750 for a historic district. But any of the design review, there's no fees associated with that.
Okay, great, thank you.
No problem. And then it looks like we have time for one more question. I believe Kevin is going to be promoted. think. Hi, Kevin. Looks like you're on mute. If you want to unmute yourself. Oh, did he go away? Did we drop him? Well, I'm not sure if he's still there, but I'm reading in the Q&A. He's asking about ADUs and if they are allowable in all historic districts. They are allowed in certain historic districts, so ADUs or accessory dwelling units. They are allowed where it's allowed by zoning. It's something that we in landmark preservation encourage the use of ADUs. It provides a density into the historic districts. It provides needed sort of that middle missing housing, so it provides that. And so we in landmark preservation are very supportive of it. It oftentimes takes the pressure off the primary house, and the changes are oftentimes occurring at the rear of the property, so it doesn't typically change the historic character of the district, but does provide that affordable or more affordable housing. But it is currently only allowed where it's allowed by zoning. And Kevin, I see you've joined us again. Is there any other follow-up questions you have on that, or did I answer your questions?
That was perfect, Kara. Thank you. My connection stopped right,
All
I
right.
think 30 minutes into the program, but I did hear most of your answer.
Okay, good,
So
great.
Dependent on the zoning.
Yeah. So it just really is dependent on the zoning. And if you have any other specific questions about it, please feel free to email us or email my zoning colleagues if you have any questions about the zoning questions on that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining. So thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate it. It looks like we are right at the time. So thank you all, and come back next month in March 11th, for an introduction to landmark design review. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.